They thought a white veil could cover a lifetime of differences. My family pushed me to the altar in my sister's place, believing Alistair Sterling would never notice the switch in the dark. Before we begin, take a breath. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. The dressing room at the back of the cathedral smelled of sterile white lilies and heavy hairspray, a suffocating combination that tasted entirely like a lie. I sat perfectly still before the vanity mirror, watching the reflection of a ghost. Evelyn, my mother, stood behind me, her manicured fingers twisting the final, rigid hairpin into my scalp with a sharp, punitive force. She did not look at my face in the glass. She only looked at the heavy, cascading layers of the wedding dress, a massive, sprawling cage of stiff satin and imported tulle that was meant to belong to my twin sister. "Keep your head down," my mother instructed, her voice a low, clipped hiss that barely carried over the muffled sound of the organ playing out in the nave. "The veil is thick enough. You will not speak. You will not hesitate. You will walk down that aisle, you will sign the registry, and you will secure the Sterling accounts. Do you understand me, Clara?" I did not answer immediately. I merely analyzed the cold, oppressive weight of the pearl collar wrapped tightly around my throat, feeling entirely unmoored in a life that was currently being overwritten. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My reality was slightly different. My mother was very much alive, standing right behind me, but my father, Richard, had indeed buried us in a mountain of corporate debt that was slowly crushing the air out of our family home. Vanessa, the golden child, the glamorous, loud, and fiercely transactional daughter, had been promised to Alistair Sterling to clear that ledger. But Vanessa had fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind nothing but an empty closet and a hastily scribbled note. I was not chosen. I was drafted. I was the collateral they had left behind, shoved into a dress that was 2 inches too long, and a life that was never meant to be mine. My father paced the length of the small room, checking his gold watch every 10 seconds, his face pale with the terror of imminent foreclosure. He viewed us not as daughters, but as highly volatile financial instruments. He did not care about the terrifying reputation of the reclusive billionaire waiting at the altar. He only cared about the signature that would save him from ruin. "It's time," Richard snapped, his jaw tight. He did not offer his arm with warmth. He seized my elbow like a warden, escorting a prisoner to the gallows. Just before they pulled me out the door, I reached into the hidden pocket I had hastily sewn into the inner lining of the massive skirt. My fingers brushed against the small, chipped amber glass of my lavender oil law. It was the only thing I owned in this entire room, a quiet inheritance from my late grandmother. I pressed a single drop to my inner wrist, letting the earthy, soft scent ground me against the overwhelming clinical smell of the church lilies. It was a tiny, silent act of rebellion. I was wearing Vanessa's dress, Vanessa's pearls, and Vanessa's suffocating veil, but I would breathe my own air. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary swung open, and the music swelled, vibrating through the cold marble floor beneath my shoes. I kept my head bowed, exactly as instructed, watching the hem of the heavy silk drag across the stone. The walk felt endless, a slow march through a gauntlet of blurred, murmuring faces. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable shout of discovery, waiting for the devastating humiliation, when the powerful man at the end of the aisle realized he was being handed a forgery. When I finally reached the altar, Richard practically shoved my trembling hand forward and stepped back, retreating into the shadows as quickly as his cowardice would allow. I stood alone before Alistair Sterling. Through the thick, blinding mesh of the white veil, he looked less like a groom and more like a monolith of dark winter stone. He was tall, perfectly still, radiating an intense, formidable gravity that demanded absolute silence from the massive room. He did not reach for me immediately. He simply stood there, a towering presence of dark wool and sharp, unyielding angles, observing the violent tremor shaking my shoulders. Then he extended his hand. I placed my freezing, shaking fingers into his palm. The contrast was shocking. His hand was large, incredibly warm, and slightly calloused along the edges. Not the soft, manicured hand of a pampered tycoon, but the grounded grip of a man who understood the physical weight of the world. The moment our skin met, I felt an abrupt shift in his stillness. Vanessa was loud, bold, and fiercely confident. She would have gripped his hand with a possessive, calculated pressure. My touch was fragile, reluctant, and terrified. Alistair's long fingers curled around mine. He did not yank his hand away. Instead, his thumb moved with excruciating gentleness, sliding past the lace cuff of my borrowed dress to rest directly against the erratic, frantic beating of my pulse point. In that micro-movement, the heat of his skin warmed the trace of lavender oil I had applied just minutes before. He froze. The silence between us stretched, heavy and dangerous. I braced myself for the explosion. I waited for him to throw my hand back, to demand the lights be brought up, to expose my father's desperate, greedy fraud to the entire congregation. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for the crushing weight of his legendary anger. Instead, Alistair stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us, until the dark fabric of his suit brushed against the massive skirts of my dress. With a subtle, deliberate shift of his broad shoulders, he positioned himself entirely between me and the pews where my parents sat. He built a human wall, cutting off Richard and Evelyn's line of sight, shielding my trembling frame from the hundreds of eyes in the room. He didn't shield me because he cared for my family's reputation, but because he felt the violent tremor in my hands and chose mercy. He leaned down, his face hovering just inches from the thick barrier of my veil. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of clean rain and sharp peppermint. "You are not your sister," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely disturbed the air between us. "And for that, I am entirely grateful." My eyes snapped open beneath the lace. The world tilted on its axis. He knew. He knew instantly, not by looking at my face, but by the quiet rhythm of my pulse and the scent of my skin. My essence was entirely muted, trembling faintly like a trapped bird waiting for the snare. I looked up, trying to catch the expression in his dark gray eyes through the netting, but he had already straightened his posture, turning his attention to the officiant. He did not let go of my hand. In fact, his grip tightened just a fraction, a solid anchoring weight that commanded my panic to subside. The rest of the ceremony passed in a surreal, echoing blur. I spoke the required vows and was barely above a whisper, terrified that the officiant would notice the discrepancy. But Alistair's commanding presence forced the proceedings forward without a single hitch. He orchestrated the entire charade with flawless, terrifying competence, ensuring that my family believed their toxic deception had worked perfectly. When it was time for the kiss, he did not lift the veil. He simply leaned down and pressed his lips firmly against the white lace, covering my forehead, a gesture of profound, protective restraint that sent a strange, unexpected wave of warmth straight down to my bones. Within an hour, the signatures were dry on the ironclad registry, and the massive wooden panels of the cathedral closed behind us, shutting out the murmurs of the crowd and the calculating stares of my parents. The transition from the oppressive spectacle of the wedding to the absolute isolation of Alistair's private world happened rapidly. The heavy doors of his black car thudded shut, instantly severing us from the noise of the city. As the driver navigated away from the cathedral, the sky finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour of cold Pacific Northwest rain. The heavy drops lashed rhythmically against the tinted glass, blurring the streetlights into long, golden smears. Inside the car, the silence was absolute. It was not the suffocating, dangerous silence I was used to in the Vance household, the kind that usually preceded cruel insults or flying porcelain. This silence was observant, patient, and deeply heavy. I sat perfectly rigid against the far door, my hands folded tightly in my lap, still trapped inside the massive, suffocating layers of Vanessa's dress. Alistair sat on the opposite side, staring out the rain-slicked window, giving me an entire ocean of physical space to breathe. We drove for over an hour, leaving the city lights entirely behind, climbing higher into the dense, foggy elevations of the coastal forests. When the car finally slowed, the headlights swept across towering ancient pines and craggy wet stone. Alistair's estate loomed in the darkness, a massive, brooding structure of dark granite and heavy timber that looked less like a modern mansion and more like a fortress built to withstand a century of storms. When the car stopped, Alistair stepped out into the rain first. He did not wait for the driver. He opened my door himself, offering his large hand to help me navigate the ridiculous, soaking volume of the wedding dress over the wet gravel. The air outside was freezing, smelling intensely of ozone, damp earth, and sharp pine. We walked through the massive double doors of the estate, stepping into a grand foyer that smelled deeply of raw cedar wood and old, polished stone. Standing quietly near the grand staircase was Martha Gable, the head housekeeper. She was a woman of indeterminate age with sharp, intelligent eyes, wearing a simple, immaculate apron that smelled faintly of starch and peppermint. She held a stack of warm, thick towels. Martha looked at me. Her eyes dropped to the hem of the dress, then moved to the heavy veil still pinned to my hair, and finally settled on my trembling, bare shoulders. She did not gasp. She did not ask a single question about where the glamorous, infamous Vanessa Vance was. She simply stepped forward and draped a heavy, heated towel gently over my shoulders. "Welcome home, ma'am," Martha said, her voice soft and incredibly kind. "The fire is already lit." I gripped the edges of the warm towel, feeling a sudden burning prickle of tears behind my eyes at the simple, unearned kindness of the gesture. Before I could thank her, Alistair stepped slightly in front of me, taking the lead. "Martha will handle the rest of the staff," Alistair said quietly, looking down at me. "Come with me, Clara." It was the first time he had spoken my actual name. The sound of it falling from his lips in this massive, quiet house felt incredibly strange, like a heavy stone dropping into a still pond. He turned and walked down a long, dimly lit corridor, leading away from the grand, formal living spaces. I followed him, the heavy silk dragging awkwardly behind me. We moved away from the sterile, museum-like perfection of the main house, and entered a private, quiet wing where the air felt distinctly warmer, smelling strongly of burning cedar and lavender. Alistair stopped in front of a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. He reached into the pocket of his dark suit and pulled out a cedarwood fob key. He did not unlock the door himself. He reached out and gently pressed the rigid metal directly into my cold palm, closing my fingers over the rough wood. "This wing is yours," he said, his voice stripped of all corporate armor, leaving only a quiet, steady exhaustion. "No one enters without your permission. Not the staff, and certainly not me. There is a lock on the inside. Use it if you need to." I stared at the heavy key in my hand, my mind struggling to process the profound, shocking level of autonomy he was offering a woman who was supposed to be a piece of purchased collateral. I looked up at his stoic, shadowed face, searching for the catch, the hidden demand, but there was only a quiet, unwavering patience in his gray eyes. "Go inside," he instructed softly. "Take off that ridiculous dress. Get warm." He turned and walked away before I could utter a single word of gratitude, his footsteps fading into the quiet depths of the estate. I stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, before turning the brass key in the lock. The door clicked open, with a heavy, satisfying thud. I pushed it open and stepped inside, expecting to find a generic, luxurious guest suite, cold, immaculate, and devoid of personality. Instead, I found a true sanctuary. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a massive stone fireplace crackling merrily on the far wall. The furniture was heavy, comfortable, and worn, wrapped in soft, deep green velvet. But what stopped my breath entirely was not the architecture or the warmth. It was the small, sturdy bedside table next to the imposing wooden bedstead. Resting perfectly on the polished wood was a neat, carefully aligned stack of old, cracked, leather-bound books. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I abandoned the heavy wet train of the dress and rushed across the room. I dropped to my knees beside the table, my trembling fingers reaching out to trace the faded gold lettering on the spine of the top volume. It was an antique collection of romantic poetry. Below it were my history texts, my sketchbooks, and a worn linen-bound diary. I leaned closer, closing my eyes as the faint, unmistakable scent of vanilla and old paper rose from the pages. They smelled exactly like my mother's attic. 3 months ago, Evelyn had hired a crew to clear out the attic, declaring my quiet collections a pathetic waste of space that needed to be thrown in the incinerator to make room for Vanessa's expanding winter wardrobe. I had stood in the driveway, silently weeping as the boxes were hauled away by a private disposal company, mourning the loss of the only things in the house that had ever truly belonged to me. Yet here they were. Alistair Sterling had not simply recognized me at the altar tonight. He had known who I was long before the veil was ever pinned to my hair. He had quietly tracked down the disposal company, intercepted my discarded history, and painstakingly built a quiet room to keep it safe. He had expected me all along. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I sat back on my heels, the heat of the fire warming the damp chill from my skin. For the first time in my entire life, the heavy armor of my silent resilience began to crack, slowly dismantling under the quiet, devastating proof that someone had finally seen me. Morning came quietly. No trumpets, no shift in the universe. Just a pale beam of winter light, slipping through the tall glass, brushing against the foot of the enormous four-poster bed. I woke without the familiar, suffocating knot of dread tightening in my chest. For the first time in 22 years, there was no sharp voice echoing up the stairs. No frantic demands to shrink myself into a corner so my sister could consume the rest of the room. There was only the steady, rhythmic drumming of the crystal downpour against the window panes. I sat up slowly, my fingers grazing the worn, linen-bound cover of my maternal diary on the nightstand. The faint scent of vanilla and old paper grounded me, a quiet reassurance that the events of the previous night had not been a fever dream. I looked toward the heavy wooden door. It was still closed, exactly as I had left it. The cedar wood fob key rested faithfully on the polished table. Alistair had kept his word. He had not crossed the threshold, dressing in simple, comfortable clothes, a soft gray sweater and worn trousers that Evelyn would have immediately condemned as entirely unfit for a billionaire's wife. I finally turned the lock and stepped out into the quiet corridor. The heavy silk of yesterday felt like a discarded skin left far behind. The air in the estate was cool and vast, smelling of wood smoke and polished stone. I navigated the long hallways, tracing the sound of a low, melodic hum coming from the back of the house. I found the kitchen bathed in the soft gray light of the storm. Martha was standing by the massive cast-iron stove, wiping down a spotless counter. She offered me a warm, silent nod, pointing a discreet finger toward the adjoining dining room. I paused in the doorway. Alistair was already seated at the head of a long, dark oak table. He was not wearing the intimidating, sharp suits of his corporate empire. He wore a simple, dark woven sweater. His reading glasses pushed slightly down the bridge of his nose as he reviewed a stack of printed documents. The absolute stillness of the man was hypnotic. He did not radiate the frantic, nervous energy of my father, who constantly checked his watch and paced like a trapped animal. The stoic man sat with the immovable gravity of a mountain. I took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking slightly beneath my feet. He did not startle. He simply looked up, his dark gray eyes locking onto mine with a steady, unreadable calm. He did not demand a cheerful morning greeting. He did not ask if I had slept well, sparing me the obligation of a polite lie. Instead, he reached out with his large, slightly calloused hand and pushed a small porcelain plate across the smooth wood toward the empty chair to his right. On the plate was a single slice of warm buttered toast. Beside it, a steaming mug of black tea. I walked over and sat down. We did not speak. The only sounds in the vast room were the clinking of my spoon against the ceramic, the rustle of his papers, and the relentless rain beating against the glass. It was a profound, heavy silence, but it was not the weaponized silence of my childhood. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. But his silence was a shield. It was a deliberate space cleared entirely for me, a wordless permission to simply exist without having to perform, entertain, or justify my presence. This quiet breakfast became our daily vow. Over the next 2 weeks, and the routine never wavered. We shared the morning light, the bitter warmth of the tea, and the absolute safety of the unspoken. He left for his private study shortly after, carrying the weight of his empire behind closed doors, while I wandered the estate, discovering small, hidden pockets of peace. It was during one of these quiet, wandering afternoons that the fragile illusion of my family's grand design finally shattered completely. I was walking through the front hall when I noticed Alistair's heavy winter coat draped carelessly over the back of a leather armchair. As I walked past, a small, dark object on the floor caught my eye. It was a large horn button, severed from the thick wool of the sleeve, the broken threads frayed and hanging loose. I picked it up, rolling the smooth, cold edge between my thumb and forefinger. In the Vance household, a missing button on a coat would have resulted in a screaming fit from Richard, followed by my mother frantically blaming the nearest maid. Here it was just a quiet casualty of a long day. I am an artisan by nature. My hands know how to mend, how to weave, how to restore things that have been broken. I slipped the button into my pocket, retrieved a small sewing kit from my room, and picked up the heavy coat, intending to return it to his private study. The door to his office was slightly ajar. I knocked softly against the wood, but there was no answer. Pushing it open, I stepped into a room that smelled intensely of cedarwood, rich leather, and sharp ink. The walls were lined entirely with towering bookshelves, and a massive mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, overlooking the dark, churning waters of the coastal inlet. The room was empty. I moved to drape the heavy coat over the back of his desk chair, my fingers tracing the worn edge of the wool. As I turned to leave, a flash of color near the floor caught my attention. Sitting inside the woven metal wastebasket beside the desk was a sealed envelopes. I froze. Even from 2 feet away, I recognized the heavy, arrogant loops of the handwriting. It was Vanessa's script, but what struck me immediately was not the writing itself, but the cloying, artificial scent of crushed roses radiating from the paper. It was my twin sister's signature perfume, a smell that had always dominated every room she entered, suffocating all the air. Here, in this timber-infused haven, it smelled cheap, intrusive, and entirely out of place. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I looked closer. There were at least a dozen envelopes. Some were postmarked from weeks ago, back when she was still eagerly boasting to Evelyn about the passionate, intense correspondence she was keeping with the reclusive billionaire. She had claimed she possessed his heart, that she was wrapping him around her finger, with her wit and charm. Every single envelope in the wastebasket was sealed. The dark red wax stamps remained perfectly intact, the paper uncreased, the arrogant golden monograms untouched. He had not read them. He had simply received them, recognized the scent of a woman who viewed him entirely as a financial conquest and discarded them without a second thought. I pressed my hand to my mouth, a sudden, overwhelming wave of realization washing over me. My parents had built an entire empire of lies on the assumption that Alistair Sterling was blinded by Vanessa's glamorous facade. They had forced me into her dress, terrified that he would discover he was losing the woman he loved. But he had never loved her. He had never even entertained her. His complete disinterest in my sister had been set in stone long before the wedding invitations were ever printed. When he touched my wrist at the altar, when he smelled the quiet, earthy scent of my lavender oil, he wasn't grieving a loss. He was recognizing a truth he had already chosen. I slowly backed away from the desk, leaving the coat over the chair, my hands trembling as I retreated into the hallway. The heavy armor I had worn my entire life, the belief that I was nothing more than an invisible placeholder, a tragic substitute for a grand romance, cracked right down the middle, crumbling into dust on the polished stone floor. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind howled against the granite walls of the estate, carrying a brutal mixture of sleet and snow that rapidly buried the coastline in a deep, blinding white. The winter storm isolated us entirely, severing the estate from the roads, the city, and the frantic demands of the outside world. I was sitting on the deep velvet sofa in my private wing, a thick woolen blanket pulled over my knees, watching the ice form intricate, jagged patterns against the window glass. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. A soft, deliberate knock at the door broke the trance. I called out quietly, my voice sounding strangely loud in the silent room. The heavy wooden door opened, and Alistair stepped inside. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, carrying a simple, hand-thrown chamomile tea set on a wooden tray. The delicate scent of chamomile immediately cut through the cold air of the room, warm and profoundly soothing. He did not ask for permission to sit. He simply walked to the low table in front of the sofa, set the tray down, and took a seat in the armchair opposite mine. He poured the tea in silence, the soft clinking of the porcelain blending seamlessly with the roar of the wind outside. He handed me a steaming cup. I took it, letting the heat of the ceramic seep into my cold palms, watching the steam rise between us. "The roads are completely impassable," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames of the fireplace. "We will be cut off from the city for at least 3 days." "I don't mind the snow," I murmured, taking a small sip of the chamomile. It was brewed perfectly, sweet and earthy. Alistair leaned back in his chair, his broad shoulders relaxing slightly against the leather. He watched me for a long moment, his gray eyes reflecting the warm orange light of the fire. There was a distinct shift in the atmosphere, a heavy, anticipatory weight that signaled the end of our comfortable silence. "Your father attempted to access the corporate accounts this morning," Alistair said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical register. It was the voice he used to dismantle rivals, cold and ruthlessly precise. My breath hitched in my throat. I lowered the cup, my knuckles turning white around the ceramic. The reality of my transactional existence came rushing back, threatening to drown the fragile peace I had found in this room. Richard had wasted no time. He had traded his forgotten daughter for a lifeline, and now he was pulling the rope. "Did he?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, fighting to maintain my dignity. I braced myself for the anger, for the resentment of a man who was now legally bound to a black hole of debt. The stoic man did not look angry. He looked entirely undisturbed. He attempted a direct wire transfer of $3 million, citing a clause in the preliminary marriage contract. Alistair continued, his tone dangerously calm. "A contract that was drafted on the assumption that he was providing me with his eldest daughter." I closed my eyes, the shame burning hot and bitter at the back of my throat. I had nothing to offer him to cover that massive ledger. I swallowed hard, the words tasting like ash, feeling entirely like the collateral they had designed me to be. "Clara." My name snapped through the air, sharp and absolute, demanding my attention. I opened my eyes. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, the physical distance between us suddenly vanishing. "You are not collateral," he stated, his voice a low, fierce vibration. "And your father will not see a single cent of my money." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the absolute finality of his words. The contract had been the only reason for this entire terrifying charade. "The contract was void the moment you walked down that aisle," he interrupted my racing thoughts, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse jump. "I authorized my legal team to sever all financial ties with Richard and Evelyn at dawn. I have permanently blocked their access to my corporate accounts, my private holdings, and my properties. They have absolutely nothing." The silence in the room became deafening. I sat frozen, the steam from the tea curling around my face. My toxic parents had sold my future to clear their debts. Confident in their manipulative mastery, they had sacrificed me to a man they believed to be a ruthless tyrant, expecting a massive payout in return. Instead, they had walked away with empty hands, entirely outplayed by a man who had seen through their hollow illusions from the very beginning. "They will be furious," I breathed, terrified of the impending fallout. "He will not stop. He will drag your name through the press. He will ruin your reputation to get what he wants." "Let him try," Alistair said softly, a dark, terrifying confidence settling over its features. "I am not afraid of Richard Vance. My only concern is you." He reached across the small table. He did not grab my hand, nor did he pull me toward him. He simply laid his large, warm palm open on the edge of the wood, an offering, not a demand. "I have erected a permanent wall between you and the people who commodified your existence," he continued, his voice losing its sharp edge, softening into something dangerously tender. "They cannot reach you here. They cannot sell you. They cannot demand your obedience, and they cannot hurt you ever again." He paused, the heavy silence stretching between us, filled only by the crackle of the hearth. The untouchable billionaire, a man feared by entire industries, was looking at me with a profound, terrifying vulnerability. "But I understand that my protection is heavy," he murmured, his eyes dropping briefly to my trembling hands before rising to meet my gaze again. He was giving me the one thing my family had stolen from me since the day I was born: absolute agency. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he whispered quietly. The words hung in the warm, cedar-scented air. It was a complete surrender of his immense power, a humble request for my consent. He was not acting as my warden. He was not claiming ownership over my life as repayment for saving me. He was simply offering himself as a shield, standing in the freezing rain, waiting to see if I would open the door. I looked at his open hand resting on the table. For 22 years, I had built my walls out of quiet resilience, surviving by shrinking into the shadows, expecting nothing but transactional betrayal from the people who were supposed to love me. I had expected my new husband to be a jailer. Instead, he was the only sanctuary I had ever known. Slowly, deliberately, I uncurled my fingers from the warm ceramic mug. I reached across the table, closing the distance, and laid my trembling hand gently into the center of his palm. His fingers immediately curled around mine, solid, warm, and uncompromising. He did not pull away. He did not speak. The fierce, desperate tension that had been coiled tight in his broad shoulders finally dissolved, leaving behind a profound, unshakable peace. Outside, the storm raged blindly against the stone walls, but inside, sitting by the fire, with the scent of chamomile drifting through the air, the heavy armor of my past finally fell away. The winter storm broke 3 days later, leaving the Pacific Northwest estate buried under a heavy, blinding blanket of pristine white snow. The sky cleared into a sharp, piercing blue, and the roads were finally plowed by the estate's private staff. For a brief, naive moment, I believed the silence of the snow would protect us a little longer. But toxic systems do not rest. They simply wait for the ice to melt. It was mid-morning, and the estate was wrapped in a profound, peaceful stillness. I was sitting in the vaulted library, a room Alistair had explicitly designated as my sanctuary. The warmth of the hearth kept the biting cold at bay. I sat by the frost-covered window with my maternal diary resting open on my lap. Its worn linen covered a comforting weight against my knees. I had been slowly reading through her botany sketches and notes on quiet resilience, anchoring myself in the past Alistair had salvaged for me. The scent of my inherited lavender oil vial mingled intimately with the sharp, earthy cedarwood of the massive bookshelves. Then, the heavy brass knocker on the main entrance echoed through the grand foyer. At the sound of that heavy thud, my stomach instantly plummeted. The peace I had built over the last few weeks was incredibly fragile, and my body still remembered the old conditioned panic. I closed the diary, my fingers trembling slightly as they lingered on the fabric binding, and stepped out into the stone corridor. The imposing double doors had already been opened by Martha. Standing in the foyer, shivering in expensive but entirely impractical designer coats, were Richard, Evelyn, and Vanessa. My sister looked exactly as she always did, flawless, loud, and demanding. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the winter chill, and her signature perfume, the heavy, artificial scent of crushed roses, immediately invaded the pristine, wood smoke-scented air of the estate. It clashed violently with the natural atmosphere of my new home, a sudden, suffocating intrusion of a transactional world I had thought I left behind. Richard paced the marble floor, attempting to project a corporate dominance he did not actually possess. He stammered out frantic demands regarding frozen wire transfers and broken arrangements, his desperation obvious. The financial blockade Alistair had quietly implemented was clearly strangling his business. Evelyn simply sneered at my simple wool sweater, her punitive anger flashing as she gestured for me to go change like a housemaid so Vanessa could take her rightful place. Vanessa stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the cold marble floor. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, the way one might look at an old, broken chair that had accidentally been placed in a luxury showroom. She had abandoned the wedding to chase a more exciting prospect in Europe, only to return the moment she realized her father's accounts were empty, and Alistair Sterling was not the easily manipulated mark they had assumed him to be. She dismissed me with a wave of her manicured hand, demanding I stop pretending, because she had returned to claim what was hers. Before I could process the sting of her dismissal, the heavy, rhythmic sound of footsteps echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Alistair descended slowly. He wore a dark, tailored suit that seemed to absorb the ambient winter light, his face an impenetrable mask of cold stone. He did not rush. He did not look angry. He moved with the terrifying, absolute calm of a man who owned not just the house, but the very ground they were standing on. Richard immediately stepped forward, demanding his capital for the bride he had provided, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space. Alistair did not even look at my father. He walked straight past Richard, past Evelyn, and stopped a few feet away from me. He reached out, his large, warm hand settling gently on the small of my back. The gesture was entirely possessive, but profoundly respectful, anchoring me to the floor and silencing the frantic racing of my heart. His physical proximity was an instant shield. Vanessa seized the opportunity. She stepped into Alistair's line of sight, tossing her hair over her shoulder. She was beautiful, striking, entirely hollow. She deliberately softened her tone, attempting to mimic the quiet, hesitant cadence of my own speech. She offered a breathless apology for the confusion at the altar, assuring him he no longer had to settle for a substitute. She reached out to place her hand on his forearm. Alistair shifted his weight, moving just an inch, but it was enough to leave her hand grasping empty air. He looked down at her. His gray eyes were devoid of any warmth, any curiosity, any recognition. He looked at my sister as if she were a misfiled document on his desk, a minor administrative error that needed to be discarded immediately. "I did not settle for a substitute," Alistair stated, his voice a low, slow, gravelly vibration that sent a chill through the massive foyer. "I married the woman I intended to marry." Vanessa's carefully constructed expression faltered. She blinked, the artificial softness slipping away to reveal the sharp, calculating ambition underneath as she stammered about the preliminary documents and her position as the eldest sister. Alistair cut her off with clinical indifference. He informed her he did not care what Richard promised. He only cared about who he chose, and his choice was absolute. Richard's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He abandoned his false corporate diplomacy, furiously insisting the original terms stood, aggressively demanding his money. "The original terms were burned the moment I realized what you had done," Alistair replied, finally turning his dark, unyielding gaze onto my father. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You brought a woman to my altar in a veil, hoping to deceive me. You were wrong." Vanessa tried one last time, dropping her volume to an unnatural, forced hum, begging him to let her stay, while dismissing me as a mere shadow who did not know how to handle a life of wealth. Alistair recognized the manipulation instantly. His expression hardened into something sharp and unforgiving. "Do not perform quietness for me, Vanessa," Alistair said, his tone absolute. "Clara does not speak softly to manipulate the room. She speaks softly because people like you have spent a lifetime screaming over her." The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Richard's jaw dropped, entirely stripped of his blustering bravado. Vanessa stood frozen, the color draining from her perfect face as she realized her grand, glamorous presence held absolutely zero currency in this house. Alistair turned his attentions entirely to me, his expression softening into profound devotion. "Say you're not her," Alistair commanded softly, repeating the silent vow he had made to me weeks ago. "Tell me you are not the woman who ran. Prove you are the one who stayed." "I am the one who stayed," I whispered, the words trembling but true. "Not because I was trapped, not because I was forced, but because I had found a sanctuary I was no longer willing to surrender." Alistair nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. He turned back to my parents, giving them exactly 3 minutes to vacate his property. He warned that if they ever attempted to contact me again, he would not simply freeze their accounts, but dismantle Richard's entire business piece by piece until there was nothing left but dust. Martha materialized from the shadows of the corridor, her face entirely blank, though her eyes glinted with quiet satisfaction, ready to show them out and lock the security gates permanently behind them. He did not wait to watch them leave. He did not engage in a screaming match. He simply placed his hand on my lower back and guided me away from the foyer, leaving my toxic family standing in the cold, cedar-scented hall, completely powerless and entirely irrelevant. As we walked back toward the private wing, the loud, desperate protests of my father were abruptly cut off by the weighty thud of the entryway panels slamming shut. The silence that followed was not empty. It was victorious. It was the sound of a lifelong chain finally snapping. I stopped in the middle of the corridor, my knees suddenly weak. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving me hollow and shaking. For my entire life, I had been taught that my family was an insurmountable force, a wall of guilt and obligation that I could never climb. Alistair had just torn it down with a few quiet sentences. I looked up at him. His jaw was still tight, his shoulders rigid with the residual tension of protecting what he considered his. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and lightly touched the lapel of his dark suit. "They won't stop," I whispered, the old fears deeply ingrained in my bones. "Richard is desperate. When he loses his business, he will find a way to blame you." Alistair covered my trembling hand with his large, warm palm. "I heard you cry. I didn't like it," he said softly, revealing a truth that made my breath catch. He had been there. He had been at the estate where they kept me, long before the cathedral. I promised myself then that I would not allow them to make that sound happen again. "Let Richard try." He looked down at me, his gray eyes softening into a profound, terrifying tenderness. "You are safe here, Clara. You are my wife." He guided me into the small kitchen adjacent to the private wing. Without a word, he retrieved the chamomile tea set he used every evening. I watched in silent awe as this towering, ruthless billionaire carefully measured out loose chamomile leaves, performing the mundane domestic ritual as a profound act of devotion. When he handed me the warm ceramic mug, the heat seeped directly into my trembling palms, finally thawing the last remaining traces of the winter storm inside me. The confrontation in the foyer shifted the invisible boundaries of the estate. The heavy formal distance we had maintained during the first few weeks slowly evaporated, replaced by a quiet, grounded domesticity. The winter stretched on, wrapping the Pacific Northwest in a deep, insulated cold. But inside the stone walls, the air was warm. I spent my days in the library, organizing the rescued book collection he had saved from my parents' incinerator, and tracing the margins of history texts. But Richard was a man who did not know how to lose gracefully. 2 weeks after they were thrown out of the estate, Richard managed to leverage a dying favor from one of Alistair's older board members to secure an invitation to a private, highly exclusive corporate dinner hosted in the city. It was an event Alistair was required to attend to finalize a major maritime logistics merger, and, as his wife, I was expected to stand beside him. The thought of returning to the city, of stepping back into the sterile, hyper-efficient world of transactions, sent a wave of cold dread through my stomach. But when Alistair placed the embossed invitation on the small table near my bed, resting it right next to my cedarwood fob key, he did not command my attendance. He quietly offered to handle the board and Richard alone, giving me the choice to stay by the fire where it was safe. I looked at the thick cardstock, then looked at the stoic man standing before me. He had stood as a human shield between me and my family's greed. He had given me a sanctuary, rescued my forgotten childhood, and demanded absolutely nothing in return. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It waits in the quiet spaces, brewing tea, mending torn threads, and standing firm in the rain. I could not let him stand alone in a room full of wolves. I told him I would go, my voice soft but entirely certain. The evening of the dinner, the city felt louder, sharper, and far more abrasive than I remembered. The venue was a sterile, modern glass high-rise, completely devoid of the heavy, grounded history of our coastal estate. The air inside the ballroom smelled of expensive champagne, sharp colognes, and ruthless ambition. I wore a simple, elegant dress of midnight blue silk. It was not a sprawling cage of imported tulle, nor was it dripping with ostentatious diamonds. It was understated, comfortable, and entirely my own. I carried the faint, natural scent of my lavender oil vial against my pulse points, a quiet rebellion against the synthetic luxury surrounding us. Alistair stayed close to my side, his hand resting a warm, solid weight against the small of my back as we navigated the crowded room. We had just taken our seats at the main table when Richard appeared. He looked thinner, the strain of impending bankruptcy etching deep, bitter lines into his face. Evelyn was not with him, nor was Vanessa. He was a desperate man, clinging to the final shreds of his pride. He approached the table, his eyes locked onto Alistair, ignoring me entirely. Richard leaned over the empty chair opposite us, his voice tight as he attempted to project authority. He aggressively demanded to renegotiate the original bridal contract, insisting his family still held a minor stake in the shipping lanes Alistair needed. He framed my marriage as a pending transaction, a deal that could still be adjusted, negotiated, and bought. The executives at the table fell silent, the air turning thick with sudden, uncomfortable tension. Everyone in the room knew the rumors. They knew about the substitution, the frozen accounts, the spectacular fall of my family. They were waiting to see how the ruthless billionaire would dismantle the desperate father. I stared at my hands resting in my lap, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm. Alistair did not raise his voice. He did not stand up, and he did not engage in a public shouting match. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his water, placed the glass down on the crisp white linen, and looked at Richard with a cold, absolute indifference. "There is no unfinished business, Richard," Alistair stated, his voice perfectly level. "The minor stakes your family holds were acquired by a shell company 3 days ago. You no longer have a seat at this table." Richard's face went completely pale. The last remaining leverage he thought he possessed had vanished before he even walked into the room. He gripped the back of the chair, his knuckles turning white. Dropping the facade of corporate diplomacy, he frantically turned his attention to me, weaponizing the old, deep-seated guilt he had programmed into me since childhood. He demanded that I speak up, reminding me that they had raised me and put a roof over my head, aggressively questioning how I could pay him back with such betrayal. He expected me to shrink, to apologize, to bow my head and beg Alistair for mercy. He expected the quiet, invisible daughter to fold under pressure. I looked at my father. I did not see a powerful patriarch. I saw a hollow, frightened man who valued ledgers more than human life. I did not raise my voice, but I did not look away. "You did not raise me," I said quietly, the words steady and clear in the silent room. "You calculated my depreciation. I owe you nothing." Richard recoiled as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth to shout, to unleash the furious rage I had feared for 22 years. But before he could make us a single sound, Alistair moved. Alistair reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. The entire table watched, breathless, expecting him to produce a legal document, a contract, a final death warrant. Instead, Alistair withdrew a heavy ring of antique iron keys. Among them was the cedarwood fob key he had given me on my first day. They were the master keys to the Pacific Northwest estate, the heavy, cold iron that commanded the grand doors, the private wings, the vaulted library, and the sprawling coastal grounds. They represented his entire private world, his sanctuary, his absolute authority. Alistair did not look at Richard. He turned his body entirely toward me. With a slow, deliberate reverence, he placed the dark metal pieces directly onto the white linen table in front of my plate. The metallic clink resonated sharply through the silent ballroom, a sound heavier and more definitive than any shouted declaration. "My wealth, my properties, and my future belong entirely to my wife," Alistair announced, a low, unwavering vow that commanded the attention of every executive in the room. "Clara holds the keys. She alone decides who crosses our threshold, and she has already decided that you, Richard, are permanently denied entry." The humiliation was absolute. It was not a physical brawl. It was the quiet, legally binding, and deeply symbolic transfer of total domestic and financial authority to the daughter Richard had deemed worthless. Alistair had not just protected me. He had publicly surrendered his massive, intimidating power into my quiet hands, proving to the entire world that I was not a purchased substitute. I was the architect of his sanctuary. Richard stood frozen, his eyes wide, staring at the antique iron keys resting on the table. The reality of his complete and utter defeat finally crushed the last remaining embers of his greed. He had nothing left to say. He turned, his posture completely broken, and walked out of the ballroom, disappearing into the cold, anonymous lights of the city. I sat perfectly still, staring at the jagged metal. The metal was dark, worn smooth by years of Alistair's touch. I slowly reached out, my fingers curling around the cold iron, feeling the immense, staggering weight of what he had just given me. He had given me a home. He had given me a voice. He had given me the ultimate, untouchable dignity of being chosen. Alistair reached under the table, his warm hand finding mine in the shadows, his long fingers intertwined with mine, a silent, steady anchor against the overwhelming surge of emotion threatening to spill over my defensive walls. "Let's go home," he murmured quietly, meant only for me. Not because the dinner was over, not because the deal was done, but because the sterile transactional world of the city held nothing for us anymore. We left the glass high-rise behind, stepping out into the cold winter air, entirely free of the past, holding the keys to a quiet, cedar-scented future. The drive back from the city was wrapped in a comfortable, absolute silence. His hand remained firmly over mine, grounding me as the towering glass high-rises faded into the rear-view mirror, eventually replaced by the dark, towering pines of the coast. We had won. The Vance family's toxic grip was permanently broken. Richard was powerless, Evelyn was silenced, and Vanessa was entirely irrelevant. Yet, as the massive stone gates of the Pacific Northwest estate parted for us in the dark, a quiet, lingering thought began to take root in my mind. He had protected me. He had shielded me from Richard's greed and Vanessa's cruelty. He had publicly surrendered his power, giving me the antique iron keys to his massive empire. But all of it, the sanctuary, the protection, the marriage itself, had been born from a poisoned seed. It was a reaction to my family's transactional deception. He had stepped in to rescue a hostage. But I no longer wanted to be a rescued hostage. I needed to know what we were, without the shadow of Richard's debt hanging over the foundation of our bond. I needed to ensure that this marriage was a genuine choice, made by two free people, not a gilded cage built out of obligation and pity. The next morning, the estate was entirely still. My husband had left early for his private study to manage the complex fallout of severing the corporate shipping lanes. I stood in the center of the private wing, looking at the heavy velvet curtains, the roaring stone fireplace, and the wardrobe filled with expensive, midnight blue silk and tailored wool that his staff had meticulously purchased for me. It was beautiful. It was incredibly safe. But it was a life built on a contract I had never signed. I made my choice without a single trace of anger. There was no dramatic flight, no tears of betrayal, and no frantic packing in the dark. It was a calm, deliberate step toward reclaiming my own narrative. I took a small, worn canvas duffel bag from the back of the closet. I did not pack the silk dresses. I did not take the delicate diamond earrings he had placed on my vanity the week before. I walked down the long, cedar-scented hallway to his empty office and left the master keys resting perfectly in the center of his polished mahogany desk, the heavy metal cold and unmoving. Returning to my room, I packed only the things that were undeniably mine. I placed my maternal diary at the bottom of the bag. I stacked the worn volumes of the rescued book collection on top of it, the familiar scent of vanilla and old paper, offering a quiet, steady comfort. I carefully tucked my lavender oil vial into the side pocket. And finally, I picked up the Alistair's dark woven sweater. Alistair had worn on our first morning together, the one he had carelessly left, draped over a chair in the library weeks ago. I folded it and placed it on top of my books. It smelled faintly of fresh-cut timber and peppermint. It was the only piece of him I allowed myself to take. Before I left, I encountered Martha in the grand foyer. The stoic housekeeper was silently dusting the polished stone banister. She paused, her sharp, intelligent eyes dropping to the small canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder. She did not raise an alarm. She did not run down the hall to alert the security team. She simply watched me, reading the quiet, unyielding resolve in my posture. "I am not running away, Martha," I said softly, the vast acoustics of the foyer carrying the weight of my words. "I am just stepping outside the frame for a little while. He needs to choose me without the contract, and I need to choose him without the rescue." Martha nodded slowly, a profound, maternal understanding softening her usually impassive expression. She set her cloth down on the marble and stepped forward, opening the grand wooden barriers herself. "Take a warm coat, ma'am," she instructed quietly. "The coastal wind is sharp today." I hired a local driver to take me 2 hours south, far away from the sprawling private cliffs of the Sterling estate. I had a small, forgotten savings account from my days working in a quiet bindery, barely enough to cover a month of simple living, and I used it to rent a tiny, weathered fisherman's cottage on the very edge of the craggy shoreline. The cottage was everything the grand estate was not. It was cramped, incredibly drafty, and smelled intensely of old salt, dried seaweed, and damp pine. The floorboards were scuffed white pine, groaning heavily under every step. The kitchen consisted of a single worn wooden counter and a rusted cast iron stove that required manual coaxing to light. There were no vaulted ceilings, no perfectly maintained cedar bookshelves, and absolutely no staff to brew the morning tea. It was exactly what I needed. For 3 days, I lived in total, unfiltered solitude. I scrubbed the old wooden counters until my knuckles ached and the skin peeled. I chopped small blocks of kindling in the freezing rain to feed the stubborn hearth. I sat on the drafty porch wrapped tightly in his Alistair's dark woven sweater, watching the turbulent, gray waves crash violently against the jagged rocks. I was entirely alone, stripped of the billionaire's protection and my family's crushing expectations. And in that raw, biting cold, I found the final unshakable piece of my dignity. I survived. I was capable. I was not a fragile piece of collateral that would shatter the moment the shield was removed. I was Clara Vance, an artisan, a reader of old poetry, and a woman who could stand perfectly steady on her own 2 feet. I missed him with a physical ache that shocked me. I missed the quiet gravity of his presence, the protective heat of his large, calloused hands, and the absolute safety of his silence. But I did not reach for the phone. I knew, with absolute certainty, that if our connection was real, it would not require a legal document or a tracking device to survive the distance. It had to be a choice. On the evening of the 4th day, a heavy coastal fog rolled in from the churning ocean, burying the small cottage in a thick, suffocating gray mist. I was standing by the rusted stove, trying to boil water in a chipped tin kettle. The wind was rattling the loose bottom hinge of the front door, a rhythmic, annoying metallic clatter that I hadn't yet figured out how to fix. Then, the rattling stopped. It was replaced by a single, solid knock. The sound was not frantic. It was deliberate, heavy, and deeply familiar. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. I turned away from the stove, wiping my damp hands on my simple canvas apron. The floorboards creaked loudly as I walked toward the entryway. My pulse drummed a rapid, heavy rhythm against my ribs, echoing the violent sound of the ocean outside. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and turned the stiff brass lock, pulling the door open against the howling wind. Alistair Sterling stood on the narrow, weathered porch. He was not flanked by security. He had not arrived in a fleet of black corporate vehicles. He was completely alone, his broad shoulders covered in a simple damp wool coat. The thick fog clung to his dark hair, and the biting wind had left a faint flush on his usually pale, stoic face. He looked massive in the frame of the tiny, dilapidated doorway, a towering monolith of a man completely out of place in this rustic, working-class sanctuary. He did not barge inside. He did not raise his voice to demand why I had abandoned the safety of his fortress. He stood perfectly still, on the worn wooden planks, his dark gray eyes sweeping over my face, tracing the lack of fear, the quiet calm, and the heavy, oversized weave of his own sweater wrapping my shoulders. "You left the keys on my desk," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut straight through the noise of the coastal storm. It was not an accusation. It was a quiet observation of a profound truth. "I couldn't keep them," I replied softly, my voice steady, refusing to break eye contact. "They belonged to an empire built on a transaction. You gave them to me to prove I wasn't collateral. But I needed to know who I was without the fortress." His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of the intense emotional current running beneath his calm exterior. He looked past me, his gaze taking in the cramped, drafty room, the peeling paint on the walls, and the tiny, sputtering fire in the hearth. He looked directly at the downscaled, ordinary life I had chosen over his billions. "Are you safe here, Clara?" he asked quietly. "I am," I said, lifting my chin. "For the first time in my life, I am entirely myself." He nodded slowly, accepting my autonomy without a single shred of corporate ego. He did not ask me to pack my bags. He did not offer to buy the coastline, pave the road, or upgrade the cottage. Instead, he reached into the deep pocket of his damp wool coat. He withdrew a small, heavy iron wrench. "The bottom hinge on this door is stripped," the stoic man stated, his tone shifting into the practical, grounded cadence of someone who worked with his hands. "The wind will tear it off the frame by morning if the storm worsens." I stared at him, completely unmoored by the absolute humility of his response. A man who commanded global shipping lanes, who could crush financial dynasties with a single signature, had driven 2 hours through blinding coastal fog not to reclaim his purchased wife, but to fix a broken hinge on a rented wooden door. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold, only when I silently stepped aside to grant him entry. He knelt on the scuffed pine floorboards, his long legs folding awkwardly in the cramped space. He did not care about the dirt, the salt, or the dampness seeping into the expensive wool of his trousers. He simply applied the wrench to the rusted iron, his large, capable hands working with quiet, meticulous precision. I stood by the kitchen counter, watching the broad line of his back, the steady, rhythmic movement of his shoulders. The scent of rich wood grain and brisk mint began to fill the small room, mingling perfectly with the salt and pine, overriding the cold dampness with a profound, anchoring warmth. When the hinge was secure, he tested the door, closing it firmly against the wind. The draft instantly vanished. The cottage felt 5 degrees warmer. He placed the iron wrench on the small entryway table and turned to face me. The physical distance between us was barely 3 feet in the narrow room. He looked at the chipped tin kettle beginning to whistle on the rusted stove. Without asking for permission, he walked past me, his arm brushing lightly against my shoulder. He took the kettle off the heat. He opened his coat and retrieved the familiar chamomile tea set. He had packed in a protected leather satchel. He had brought it with him. He brewed the tea in absolute silence, measuring the loose leaves, with the exact same quiet reverence he displayed in the massive kitchen of the estate. The mundane, domestic ritual felt incredibly intimate in this tiny space. When it was ready, he poured the golden liquid into 2 mismatched chipped mugs I had found in the cupboards. He handed me a mug. The heat seeped into my palms, sending a wave of absolute, terrifying comfort straight to my core. He did not retreat to a formal armchair. There were no velvet sofas here. He simply sat down on the worn braided rug in front of the small hearth, leaning his broad back against the edge of a modest wooden chair. He stretched his long legs out toward the fire, looking completely at peace. He looked up at me, his gray eyes dark and incredibly soft in the firelight. He did not demand an explanation. He just waited in the silence. I walked over and sat down beside him on the rug. Our shoulders brushed, a point of solid, undeniable contact in the quiet room. "I didn't leave because I was afraid of you," I whispered, staring into the flickering orange flames. "I left because I was afraid of the contract. My family switched the brides because they thought they could control the outcome. They thought money was the only thing that bound 2 people together. I needed to stand in a room where your money couldn't reach, just to see if you would still want to find me." He absorbed my words, his gaze fixed on the fire. He set his mug down on the floorboards. He reached out and gently took my chipped mug, setting it down next to his. Then, he turned his body entirely toward me. He reached up, his large, warm hands gently framing my face. His thumbs brushed lightly across my cheekbones, tracing the lines of exhaustion and quiet defiance. He was a man made of winter stone and cold logic, but in this tiny, drafty room, his touch was nothing but reverent, desperate warmth. "There is no contract," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "There is no debt. There is no Vance family, and there is no empire in this room. There is only a man who heard you cry in a dark hallway, and who swore to the silence that when it would spend the rest of his life making sure you never had to hide your tears again." He leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against mine. The physical proximity shattered the last remaining fragments of my defensive armor. "I did not recognize you at the altar because of the lavender oil," he whispered, confessing the deepest secret of his stoic heart, his breath warm against my skin. "I recognized you because your hand trembled exactly the way mine did when I was entirely alone. I recognize my own isolation in you, Clara. You are the only person who has ever made the quiet feel like home." The tears I had held back for 22 years finally broke. They did not fall in a dramatic sobbing wave, but in a quiet, steady stream of profound emotional release. I closed my eyes, letting the tears track down my cheeks, entirely unafraid of my own vulnerability. Alistair did not pull away. He did not offer hollow platitudes. He simply held my face, his thumbs gently catching the tears as they fell, accepting my grief, my fear, and my joy all at once. "This is how you pay me back." Richard had once hissed at me in the dark, demanding my absolute submission. But he was wrong. You do not pay back a lifetime of emotional debt with wire transfers or stolen shipping lanes. You pay it back by refusing to let the cruelty define the rest of your life. You pay it back by choosing the quiet over the screaming. I wrapped my hands around his wrists, grounding myself in the solid, steady pulse beating beneath his skin. I leaned into his touch, kissing the rough, calloused edge of his palm. It was an absolute surrender, not of my dignity, but of my isolation. "You can't fit your corporate board in this cottage," I whispered, a faint, watery smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. He let out a low, rough exhale that sounded remarkably like a laugh. "I resigned from the board yesterday," he replied smoothly, the quiet revelation shocking me into absolute silence. "I transferred the majority holdings to the trust. The shipping lanes are managed. The empire will run itself." I stared at him, my eyes wide in the dim firelight. "You walked away from all of it?" "I walked toward you," he corrected quietly, his thumbs brushing my jaw. "Write the life you want. I'll meet you there. If you choose a grand stone estate, I will keep the fires lit. If you choose a drafty fisherman's cottage on a freezing coast, then I will learn how to fix the hinges. I do not care where we are, as long as I am sitting beside you." He lowered his head, and for the first time since the cold, formal press of his lips against my veil at the cathedral, he kissed me. It was not rushed. It was not a grand, cinematic collision of explosive passion. It was slow, devastatingly tender, and incredibly deep. It was the physical manifestation of a slow-burn devotion that had quietly built itself in the silent margins of our shared trauma. His lips were warm, tasting of chamomile and rain, asking for nothing but offering absolute emotional safety. I kissed him back, my fingers sliding into the dark, damp hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. The cold wind howled outside, beating violently against the weathered walls of the cottage, but inside, the air was completely still, insulated by a love that had entirely outgrown its transactional beginnings. We did not return to the city. We did not immediately return to the massive stone estate, either. For the next 3 months, the untouchable billionaire and the forgotten daughter lived in a tiny coastal cottage that smelled heavily of siege, lavender, and ocean salt. He learned how to chop kindling without splitting the wooden porch. I learned how to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic. We built a life out of slow, quiet routines. Morning tea by the hearth, long walks on the jagged shoreline, and evenings spent reading worn poetry books while the rain lashed against the glass. Eventually, when the spring finally arrived and the ice thawed along the coast, we packed the small, canvas duffel bag and drove back to the estate. But it no longer felt like a fortress or a sanctuary built to hide from the world. It was simply our home. The massive vintage master keys were no longer symbols of corporate authority. They were just the things we used to unlock the front door. People ask sometimes, in the rare moments we step back into the public eye, how a marriage born from such a scandalous family betrayal managed to survive. They look for the drama, the screaming matches, the toxic power struggles that usually define the wealth of the city. I never know how to explain it to them. I cannot explain the profound, life-altering weight of a powerful man kneeling in the dust to fix a door hinge in the fog. Maybe there is no explanation needed. Some stories are meant to be felt more than told. All I know is this. The man who once stood like a monolith of dark winter stone at a false altar now sits quietly beside me in the library, his reading glasses pushed down his nose, a cup of chamomile tea resting on the table between us. He doesn't need to speak to tell me I am safe. I just need to breathe in the scent of cedarwood, feel the warmth of the fire, and know that out of all the choices in the world, he chose to stay in the quiet with me. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.